Hot take. I'd say a lot of the crazy these days coming out of Silicon Valley and into pop culture are driven by a few problems, two of which my guest and I are going to talk about today. First, welcome to this week's episode of Make Sense. It's a video podcast that simplifies complex issues at the intersection of tech and people, and there are a lot of them. So whether you're totally hyped on artificial intelligence and ready for the robot takeover, or you want to crawl into a cave after deleting all of your social media accounts, I'm here with my guest to help make sense of what's going on so you can design yourself into the future. Who am I? My name is Lindsay Tabus. I'm a product market fit strategist and innovation advisor. I've always been obsessed with designing technology for people, and I'm so excited to introduce my guest. With me this week is Sean Boyce. He's a serial entrepreneur and owner of Next Step Consulting, where he helps teams solve product challenges so they can scale. He's also the host of Product Launch, where he features people that have succeeded in building product businesses. I was flattered to be a guest last year. I cannot wait for this conversation. Sean, how are you?
I'm doing very well. And thank you for having me, Lindsay. That's a wonderful intro. You do a much better job than I usually do.
Well, thank you. Flattery always goes a long way.
Right?
Sean, you're an incredibly busy guy. You run multiple businesses, but the last we spoke, you had a ton on your mind about the future of engineering and the engineering discipline. You yourself have been an engineer and a product guy for 20 years. So what's swirling around up there?
Great question. I'm super excited to talk about this topic. And I think the first thing I'll say is my background is heavily in engineering. So got a lot of respect for the role. I've done it for a very long time. It's just kind of who I am personality wise. Since then, a lot of my focus has been in product, but I think we've seen some really interesting stuff developing like very recently, like Chat GPT and a lot of AI elements that I think are going to push that position forward into the future. And I've been thinking more about what that's going to mean. And one interesting way that I've done that has been through some research and things that I've been reading, and a lot of the people that I speak with in my network in terms of how they're leveraging these tools. Market research at its core is what I really love to perform as much as I can in order to get a better understanding, and not just where we are, but where we're going. And what I've been hearing is all the time saved that people that are working on any kind of technical builds or SaaS products have been getting from leveraging these tools in terms of helping them with building and extending what their products are capable of. So they've been using tools like ChatGPT to like write subroutines, for example, and eliminate what was like low-level coding tasks that they were doing themselves before, which would, be a bottleneck in the process sometimes and would slow them down in terms of what it was they were trying to develop. And now what they're telling me is how much time they're saving by leveraging these tools instead of having to write that stuff themselves. So I think that's a really interesting angle to it. And even more recently, I've seen OpenAI talking a little bit about what they're thinking in terms of how ChatGPT is expected to help in this area by trying to kind of eliminate as much of those like low-level engineering tasks that essentially probably don't need to be done by a person any longer once the tool is ready for it, so that we can move that much faster when we're building.
So let's take a step back. Two things. Well, one, really quickly, Chat GPT, artificial intelligence, chat interface helps you access the internet. For instance, I wrote a recommendation for a former intern of mine. Maybe I usually would go to Google and look for a template, but I opened up Chat GPT and said, can you give me a template for recommending someone to graduate school? And it just spit out a template, and I could use that. And then what I knew about my intern to write the letter, right? So it's a different way of interacting. Maybe these software developers would go to Stack Overflow or some other resource to find the code they needed or the steps they needed to do the project setup, but they can do it in ChatGPT. It's oversimplified, right? But it's a good description. It's a different interface for getting information, and it seems to be one that feels much more natural to a lot of people. But I wanted to take a step back and just talk about kind of the time intensity of software engineering. that
Hmm.
just, engineering in general, writing custom code can take a really long time. And we can't really just add new people to a software engineering team in
Hmm.
order to realize more benefits. Actually, often when you add a new person to a software engineering team, you see the productivity of that team go down for at least a few weeks or sprints before it might go back up. And I think what I heard from another podcast is that Jeff Bezos is famous for saying that a software engineering team, 7 to 8 members max, right? So there's been kind of a ceiling on the productivity of any one engineering team for quite a long time. So we keep thinking about how we can speed the process up. And maybe that means having more out of the box toolkits or potentially offloading some of the more routine and non custom code, and functionality to low code platforms. Uh,
Hmm.
so that we actually just don't need as many engineering resources as we would need in the past. Uh, all right. So besides Chat GPT, where else are product and engineering teams finding accelerators for themselves?
Yeah, and I think you bring up a number of good points there. I think the reason why we're seeing some of these tools be developed more frequently and faster these days is because that's commonly been essentially where the bottleneck has been. When we're ready to build, like you said, there's limitations in terms of improving the productivity of what those teams are capable of unless we leverage some of these tools and resources to try to do so. So I think what we've seen, very recently with ChatGPT, in terms of being able to actually take on some of the coding themselves, which is really interesting. I think we'll probably see the teams start to change shape because of it as well too, as they're figuring out how to leverage more of both those AI tools and some of these no code or low code platforms as well. Because at the end of the day, right, if the solution is adequate from a technical perspective, customer probably is maybe relatively indifferent. They're getting the value that they need, right, in terms of how it's built or what's happening behind the scenes. That's usually not of top of mind, most concern for them. So combination of both of those. And then I think we'll start to see these product teams start to take shape slightly differently as well too, where instead of all engineers, it might be less engineers, but leveraging these tools. And then I think what I'm hopeful for, given a lot of the product work that I do, and I know you as well, is for us to be able to focus then in an area of more discovery and research. Because I
Mm-hmm.
think one of the things that ultimately slows down progress now, or how the bottleneck might move, and one of the areas where we can ultimately deliver the biggest impact, at least in terms of what these teams are doing, is doing that discovery, doing that research to figure out, what to build and why that's important.
Well, often that work gets discarded altogether because
Right.
of how long engineering takes,
True.
which on both ends creates problems, right? We're spending
Definitely.
a bunch of money and a bunch of time building stuff that we're not sure customers actually want, but we don't have the time to figure out what customers want because um, engineering just takes so long to deliver.
Good point.
What is there an example out there that the average person that's not in tech can perceive a problem caused by the slowness of software engineering? The one or two that I came up with is, when what is it, healthcare.gov
Hmm.
launched, and it was a pretty big debacle, and it takes time for it to get fixed because they can only move so fast. I'm thinking also during at when the pandemic hit and the PPP loans were, passed and approved, but it
Hmm.
took quite a while for all of the banks to build the software infrastructure
Yep.
to handle the submissions and the requests. Are there any other more, I don't know, other examples of where, the common person could perceive software engineering resources and productivity being a problem?
Yeah, so many. We could talk about that alone probably for the rest of the episode.
We
The
don't want to
one,
bore anyone.
yeah, try to make it as interesting as possible. The thing that strikes me as fascinating is from a usability perspective, how many products just aren't there, despite, us being in 2023, and all of these things haven't been around for decades at this point. The strategies in terms of figuring out how to make it better. I think you raised a really good point in that because building can be such a bottleneck, a lot of these really critical, important steps either get like reduced dramatically or skipped altogether. One that I know I've heard of recently in our city, Philadelphia, is the key or the card that is used for leveraging our public transportation for the SEPTA system. For the longest time, I was waiting for even a system that like New York had, for example, where you could just use a refillable card, for example, and go through the turnstiles and do whatever you need to do public transportation wise. And they had one that you could pay a day pass and just use that as much as you want. And then many years later, the SEPTA system in Philly had ultimately developed a card, but that card wasn't able to be linked to a bank. So I needed to specifically refill the card at a kiosk. I needed to keep track of how much was on that card, and I couldn't do that unless I was at a kiosk. All of these things, and here we are, and we finally have something developed there many years later than even like a very close neighboring city has. But we can't even support tap right now. Like in
Mhm.
New York, you don't even have to use a card anymore because
Right,
most
right.
cards support tap. So you can just tap your credit card and go. Like, what is even the need for a card at this
Yeah.
point? If I go over to Europe, it gets even more ridiculous where you can just plug everything into your phone. You don't need to have to do any kind of transactions, but you just press a button when you hop on transportation in Switzerland, and then you
Hmm.
press a button when you hop off, and it just charges you based on whatever you took and wherever you went, right? So like all of these things are possible, but they're all at different levels depending on where you are or what you're doing. And the bottleneck, like you said, is typically engineering.
Yeah. Theoretically, in our world, we talk about lean or agile development, which means, move fast, break stuff, learn, and fix it. But in practice, because engineering is a bottleneck, and that's how we get to the point, as Sean said, and you said earlier, that, we have a lot of products out there that are just not up to snuff because of the lack of resources, and the ability to rapidly iterate. I
Hmm.
think about Capital One, for instance. Now, I was with ING Direct and it got acquired by Capital One. And to this day, if you log into Capital One checking account and you had ING Direct, the pay bill interface is the exact same interface from ING Direct. It is literally being served up in like an iframe kind of servlet within the Capital One infrastructure. And it has its pros and cons because I've been using it for so long. I know how it works, right? I don't have to like learn a new system, but at the same time, this is an interface that has been around for 15 years. So our ability to match what our theory is of rapidly iterating and rapidly learning is actually severely hampered. And that's why no code tools and the possible restructuring of a product team, like you suggested, is exciting because
Definitely.
you might have now, you used to like look for product team members that could cover multiple bases, a UX designer that could also do visual, or a visual designer that could also do front end, a product manager that could do some UX research type stuff. Like you're looking for a combination of pieces. And so now maybe what we used to want to see from a visual design and front end developer to rapidly prototype together, we now will be looking for visual designers that also are certified with Bubble, right?
Yep.
Or one example, Figma is the design tool that everyone is using these days. There's now our apps in the marketplace that either will create the front end design off your Figma, or even go as so far as to build the actual product. Uh,
Wild, right?
and the like, right, so that you don't even need Bubble anymore because a UX designer can build the designs and then connect this app and have a product, which speeds up the user testing and learning.
Hmm.
So can we use it for real stuff, or is it just for prototyping?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we're getting closer to ultimately having these tools be able to build something scalable, right? Because we could do so, horizontally or vertically. We can always throw more resources at it. What I always encourage people to do is like get the product built as quickly as you can and keep it as simple as possible. Because people have a tendency to go, every which way with features, thinking they need everything, including the spinning rims, in order to actually test something. You really don't. If anything, I think it actually ends up working to your favor if you keep the product simpler. If you keep the product simpler to solve a more specific problem, that makes it a lot easier for you as well too when you start talking about scaling. So I've
Mm-hmm.
seen instances where no code tools and even simple applications have been scaled. Now they might not do so particularly efficiently in terms of they may chew up more resources than if you had refactored everything into proper
Custom
programming or
code.
coding
Yeah.
language to be able to like make maximum efficiency of your resources. But again, in the beginning, does your customer care? Probably not.
Yeah.
It's really about their experience, right? So once you can, I want to remove all the bottlenecks to the process of being able to like get your product out there and test the value proposition, get that
Right.
social proof, like figure out if they're using it, figure out if they're getting value out of it, calculate the ROI. Once you've lined all of that stuff up, then go nuts. Like if you want to refactor the
Right.
application, feel free, but like not before that. You know what I mean?
Exactly, right? Right. But when you have actual users using it and people asking for more features and people willing to give you money, then let's go for the custom built app. But
Totally.
apps like Bubble, apps like Glide, or do you have experience with Glide?
Yeah, I've used that as well.
It's one of my favorite tools now. I have an app that's basically like Lindsay in your pocket. It has all of my resources from labs. I created, a spreadsheet and inventoried all of them. And clients can search by marketing resources, or they can search by chapters and lessons, stage of the startup. But all I
Lovely.
had to do is create a Google spreadsheet, and now there's an app, on the phone that people can use. So there's definitely a lot of different applications for the no code and the low code. And I've come across some limitations. I think when it comes to like something like bubble security, you don't have as much control over the security or as much of the data processing power.
Hmm.
Um, but that's okay. You can leverage these tools to get something out there quickly, as you said, and get feedback. Um, are there any other kind of parts of engineers or types of engineers that you think, or types of projects that are best for, or one that are going to be obsolete, and which skills maybe will still be needed, right?
Hmm.
Versus what will be a commodity.
Yeah, no, great question. So I think, right, writing perfect code is going to become less and less valuable, essentially. Once the speed of basically building something effective becomes that much more important, then ultimately it's going to kind of devalue it just ever so slightly, right? And there's going to be still mission critical systems that are going to be reviewed and reviewed with a fine tooth comb, but there'll be diminishing returns there because ultimately, machines are going to be able to do a lot of this work for us. So that doesn't mean that the engineering is important. It means that it shifts and it shifts to a higher level, which is how it's ultimately going to evolve. So
Yeah.
I think your skills as an engineer, if you're to kind of keep pace with the direction in which it's going, become less of a figure out how to make all the custom pieces and then put it together to figure out how to put it together with the pieces kind of prefabricated for you. It's
Hmm.
almost like building a custom home versus like building a modular home or
Right.
using
I
Legos or
was
something
thinking
like that.
about that, and
Yeah.
that metaphor. Um, and especially when we're talking about how fast engineers can work or how
Hmm.
slow. Like if you have a building built and you have a busted pipe, um, you could probably get it fixed faster in a building than you can get it fixed if it was the equivalent by software engineers.
Well said.
So, there's the Pareto Principle that says what, like
Mhm.
20% of the work, 80% of the value, or something like that. Am I getting it wrong or right? I think it's something like that.
Yeah, so 80-20 rule. So
Yeah. But
20,
then,
80% of your roles comes from 20% of kind of your work.
so now I heard someone phrase it differently. So not quite the Pareto Principle, but
Mhm.
that basically, like most organizations, 80% of their engineering requirements can be covered with low code, no code, modular
Mhm.
items, and 20% will be kind of custom, that mission critical
Mhm.
stuff that you spoke to. Does that number resonate, or are we just grabbing that because that's like a number that's already out there?
Yeah, I think it doesn't always wind up being exactly that number. It might be like 65-35, or you know what I mean? Where like there's also the Pareto principle applied to itself. And anyway, 80-20 of 80-20, but within that range for sure, for
It's
the
just
most
like,
part. Yeah, it's just inception with the same principle. But we tend to follow that for sure. And there's like leap forwards and progress along the way. So I think that's likely to be the case here moving forward as it goes through a couple different versions of evolution.
how do we balance this idea that engineering, and I want to be specific to software engineering, um, and this might be me nitpicking at words, but I'd rather say software developers because not all software developers are
Mhm.
engineers. I don't know about you. Do you have an engineering degree, or were you given that title for work?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I know there's been a lot of talk about this as well too. So I do have an engineering degree. It's not technically a software engineering degree, although it includes elements of that. It's a computer engineering degree,
Yeah, but
which
you're
was
an
like,
engineer,
yeah,
and
by
there's
education, correct.
There's, yeah, by education. So I'm an engineer by education.
Mhm.
My dad is also an engineer by both education and professional license.
Yep.
And this has come up, and I don't know if we've talked about it, but I'll repeat it for everyone listening that um, when I trademarked the Lady Engineer, I filed paperwork to do business as Lady Engineer in Pennsylvania, and I was rejected because I don't have a
Oh,
professional engineering license and I don't keep up that license with continuing education credits. At first, my dad was like, "No, my baby, she's an engineer. I'm so proud of her. How could they
yep.
do this?" And then he realized that no, there's a standard to
Hmm.
call yourself an engineer, to do
Yep.
business as an engineer. And in the, let's say, physical, tangible engineering world of mechanical engineering, civil engineering,
Yep.
um, it's really meaningful. You would not want an uncertified civil engineer
Right.
to fix the Betsy Ross Bridge. Like, you want someone to have their professional engineering license because we can, as people, literally perceive life or death for that bridge.
Hmm.
In the software world, we throw around engineer, it doesn't mean anything anymore. It means like the layman's term to create and build
Hmm.
rather than and design, but not doesn't mean any academic credentials or professional licenses. But I
Hmm.
would argue, and this is the one thing that you said about where it comes up in different industries where we really need an engineer. I would argue that there's certain things that we want actual engineers with engineering education and credentials in the software world to be owning, like in finance or
Hmm.
our national security infrastructure. Things like that is where I think we don't want that to become a commodity.
Yep.
Uh, because we can't perceive the physical of life and death, but there are some extremely
Yep.
mental life and death that turns into like self-harm and other things when people's identities are stolen and they lose money and blah, blah,
Hmm.
blah, blah. I don't want to go down that road. But I do want to mention that there's parts of software development that we want to maintain a high standard of, while parts of it can be commoditized. I just said a lot and went on a little rant. Would you like to respond to any of that?
No, I mean, I agree for the most part, right? It depends on the application, right? In terms of like the designation of developer and engineer, and we can get into all that. And, we have engineering degrees by education and things like that. And I think that there's still value for that for sure, as in it shaped kind of the way that I problem solve essentially.
Exactly.
And it's important to understand and be able to respect certain boundaries because like the laws of physics, for example, and calculus and things like that, those aren't necessarily rules you should be trying to bend or break, but
Mm-hmm.
the common expectation in the world of software is that we're, question everything type of thing. Well, not laws that have been proven for the most part that exist in the, as we understand the physical world. So we're not going to probably be playing around with those. So I think it's important to be able to understand and have respect for those and understand, if you do or don't have the required probably credentials or proper training in order to be able to work on something like that. So for sure, absolutely. I think those designations will remain and continue to be valuable, even though, we're going to see probably a lot of evolution in other areas as well.
Yeah, cool. I want to get to one other topic, and that's on a lot of people's minds right now, but it's two topics we talked about earlier kind of combined, which is the age of the tech CEO hero and whether that will come to an end, kind of crossed with VC-led startup growth. So, Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter and all of his snafus have been in, pop culture and the average person's news feed. Mark Zuckerberg's kind of failed attempt to commercialize the metaverse. Elizabeth Holmes with Theranos, and even going back to the bad behavior of Uber's former CEO, Travis Kalanick or these people are like all products of Silicon Valley and the ethos of VC driven startup growth. So what's the connection between, bad behavior and bad business, to be honest?
Great question. I mean, something that I've been beating up a lot lately, and I've produced some content about this, is the whole startup unicorn status, right? Which is kind of loosely defined as startups that ultimately become valued at more than $1 billion. And equally as long a list is the amount of startups that have reached that and then ultimately failed, so to speak, as well too. And I think this push for trying to become one of these startup unicorns is flawed in almost every sense of the imagination, in that it just promotes and encourages bad business practice. Many of them, I was studying Uber's path, for example, and I don't know if you're familiar, but back when they IPO'd years ago, they had said right around that time that they don't know if they'll ever be profitable.
Oh, yeah. The
Which, like,
company still isn't
what?
profitable, though.
Right. That's what's
It
fascinating to
still
me.
isn't profitable.
Nope. Losing billions of dollars with a B
But
every year.
the VCs saddled the public market
Mm-hmm.
with dealing with that problem so that they could cash out
Right.
early. And I had someone,
Right.
I listening to another podcast, they described it as a pyramid scheme.
I was talking about in terms of, I was referring it to as a Ponzi scheme, but same
Oh,
idea in
yeah.
that essentially it's just like you're raising from investors with deeper pockets to pay the investors that have shallower pockets. And that process just repeats indefinitely. What I don't understand is like, what's the end goal in mind here? If it doesn't ever produce a profit, which I had always assumed was the goal of healthy business, or a healthy business is capable of doing that, right? Producing a return on investment. And what are we doing here? Like, it doesn't even seems much more like, put it nicely, a hobby, put it probably the way it shares most with some form of scheme.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So do you think another trend I read about is, VCs stop hunting unicorns?
Hmm.
Um, argue that they probably should, since unicorns don't exist. They're fake animals, but
That's
but
great. It's a perfect analogy.
like, is there anything that we see that tells us that, besides the slowing of the economy, the slowing of deploying capital, but is there anything we see even amongst founders and the approach to startups at all to indicate that this is going to happen, that they're going to focus on workforces that have business models and are making money?
It's a great question. And I want to say I hope, but I'm not optimistic. I think the startup unicorn as this like allure, mythical, reach this holy grail kind of thing is probably going to continue to be attractive. while investors are looking for ridiculous level of returns, so to speak, regardless of how
Right.
practical they may or may not be. And there's so many examples of it. And you see like the story of like WeWork and things like that, where it's just like valued at 10x over what,
Well,
an actual profitable
Adam
company doing the
Newman,
same thing. And he's
yeah,
just got funding
and
again
he just
recently.
got
And it's like,
funding
that's what I
again.
mean, right? Isn't
Right.
that mind boggling? Like, how does
It's
that
mind
happen?
it's mind-boggling.
Crazy.
I think, when I moved out to Silicon Valley in 2005, we were emerging from the boom and bust.
Mhm.
Would you say at the turn of the century? Y2K. But
Yep.
that was like largely driven by like this first to market, right?
Right.
We don't need to talk to customers.
Right.
We just need to be the first one to do this thing online, right?
Hmm.
And the same thing kind of happened as we said with Uber, right? Like VCs
Yep.
pumped this thing up, dumped it on the public market. I think I heard some story about was it like Time Warner bought maybe AOL or something like, and it was
Yep.
just like they realized that it was all vaporware, like they were
Right.
gonna,
Exactly.
like there wasn't money actually in this business. It actually happened recently. JP Morgan acquired an ed tech startup for 175 million, and the founder was caught fabricating almost 4 million user accounts. And that's a whole nother podcast
Crazy. It
because
is.
I've done due diligence with 25 companies at least.
Yep.
JP Morgan, give me a call. Like, give me 1% of
Let's
the
get
deal
this
next
fixed.
time. I'll catch that
Right.
bogus for you. But um, yeah, I think it was like, pump up the mark, the
Yep.
first to market, right?
Yep.
And there's still kind of a first to market mentality that still lives on,
Hmm.
right? That's why so many fail because of no
Yep.
market need, because they build without talking to customers. But do you think Silicon Valley has learned its lesson from first to market? I think there have been some, but we're still kind of moving too fast to build quality products uh, with higher standards that protect people's personal information and make money.
Well said. I sure hope so. I mean, every time there's probably some type of joke in there about someone getting wings or something every time a VC has to lose their lunch on some kind of deal. But I think they just try to make it up by kind of repeating the same. The other thing that I think is interesting is it depends on also where a lot of the capital is sourcing from. One of the phrases that I've heard from time to time that I think is valuable is it's time for a new generation to learn an old lesson. So sometimes this stuff gets passed down, but ultimately the lessons that came with it don't follow. As such, repeat a lot of the same mistakes. I think we're probably likely to continue to see that. But one thing that I think will be a catalyst here is that money's no longer as cheap as it was. Now that if interest rates have gone back up, it becomes a lot harder to spend because it's that much more expensive. As such, now more due diligence needs to go into making sure that's going into a sound investment. So if
Mhm.
the fundamentals aren't there, if you don't have solid economics for your SaaS or your company, then it should be questionable in terms of whether or not you're ultimately going to get an investment. And that's why I'm always advocating these companies focus on a path to profitability right out of the gate. Right? You don't need to have it immediately. It can be something that requires investment, but not indefinitely, right? Not growth for growth's sake, not this negative earnings nonsense that is ultimately never intending to become profitable. Because to me, that's just not solid business
Well,
fundamentals.
I mean, to be fair, I thought like Uber was gonna maybe take over autonomous vehicles or
I
something
think
like
that
that.
was part
They
of the
thought
dream,
they thought that was their
right?
path to
And you
profitability.
think it would die if that hadn't materialized, but it's still very much going.
Well, it's had such an outsized impact on the way all of
Also true.
us kind of like live and travel and
Yep.
order food and stuff like that. But that also doesn't make, a business. I do see, from my point of view, for the past few years, investors, wanting that path to profitability
Hmm.
and not interested in investing in an ad supported
Yeah.
model. And by that, I mean, we think about Facebook being um, free to get to as many users as possible, and then they introduce ads. Investors aren't willing to take a chance that if you get 1 million users, someone will pay you.
Yep.
And that's good. So they're looking for actual
Agreed.
business models. Now, the business model du jour is a SaaS, software as a service subscription, payments and such.
Hmm.
You had some take on SaaS economics and the future of that for startups, and I'm super interested in what you're thinking about on that.
Yeah, and I produced some content on this topic recently, and it's really, I think, in this area focusing on this path to profitability and a return on investment, like getting back to the basics, right? Which at its most fundamental level is bringing in more money than you spend, essentially. That you believe, I mean, I know you would because you've been there, but how many companies do not understand that fundamental concept and are not leveraging it in order to build something that they're trying to build, right? There's all this arbitrage going on and just assuming that there's always going to be a bigger investor. And I think that's a dangerous path to head down, not just
Hmm.
because of the risk and the low odds of success, but
The
because,
dependency.
yeah, exactly. Like
Right?
it's instead, wouldn't you rather control your own destiny, figure out that path to profitability, maintain more of the ownership, control, and reward as you continue to be successful,
Right.
and you could just continually invest and grow based on your own earnings, and also just get favorable terms when it's time to, borrow some capital or raise another round. And that I would rather see the control, rest with the founders, the original team, that type of thing, then be able to kind of control their mission and destiny and bring that value to the world. So I think this is a slightly changing landscape that's going on right now. I mean, I think solid business fundamentals and economics were always popular, but there was a lot of nonsense going on at the same time too. So I think some of these changes are going to lead to ultimately stronger business models and ultimately,
Mhm.
I think, better products.
Do you think the stronger business models of the future are still kind of SaaS subscription based?
Good question. I think it's still going to be a popular topic and popular model. I think there's some industries that are trying to like really stretch it way beyond it really should go. And one that comes into question is content I've created recently around the automotive industry, where companies like BMW are trying to charge people subscription fees for accessing the heated seats that their car already has that previously they sold and you had
Yeah.
unlimited access to.
Yeah,
And
I
it's like,
think that's a
okay,
stretch.
that's not okay.
Yeah,
Right.
that's a
So,
stretch.
but in terms of the subscription model, I mean, if you're using it appropriately, so I think it's still one of the best where it fits in a lot of instances. It's not perfect for every situation, but I think it's still going to continue to be pretty popular.
Yeah, I do appreciate, like, it seems like everything is monthly when it comes to my
Hmm.
SaaS, like the tools I use for my business. I do appreciate being able to choose some of them I pay monthly, some of them I can commit
Same.
to the full year. I'm working with a startup right now, and one of the things we learned was that the price of their platform was more palatable as just offered as a
Yep.
1 year fee, that because the end user didn't perceive like they weren't going to be using this app every month
Mm,
consistently
that's cool.
every month and or multiple times a month, that getting
Hmm.
charged every month would be tiring. So billing
Yeah.
on a quarter or a 6 month or a year
Hmm.
actually made more sense.
I like
I
that.
don't have you come across anything like that?
Yeah, that's a really good point. The kind of psychological element of seeing that charge come in all the time for a product you may or may not be using. And, that might be part of the routine or maybe it's not. I think subscription fatigue is definitely a real thing. So companies need to pay close attention to that and make sure that how they're charging is appropriate. Like because so many things are subscription today almost means a lot of them default to it and just like force anything into that model. And it isn't always appropriate, or how you do it perhaps isn't always appropriate. I think Salesforce is starting to get beat up in this area quite a bit now because they've had these like ironclad contracts, which are almost impossible to get out of. and they haven't updated their product. So the
Mhm.
experience hasn't been great. People are like, HubSpot is way better, or insert whatever CRM here is actually innovating. I don't want to use this product anymore. And you've got me in this ironclad expensive contract. Like now I'm leaving with a bad taste in my mouth. So like,
Right.
even if you do fix this problem, I may never come back. So you need to
Right.
be
Because you
careful
locked
that
me
you're
in.
using exactly like you need to be careful that you're, like you said, you gave the perfect example, right? Figure out which variables should be set in which way to make for the best experience for your customer.
Yeah. You can think about, what also how often you want them to be using the software
Hmm.
and at what pace. And that's important for just judging your metrics as well. So, um, I was just thinking, and it's probably a total throwaway, but a lot of, the BMW seats being a subscription. Um, there's these like smoothies and supplements that everyone wants you to sign up for like a subscription for it.
Yep.
You're like, I just want to try you.
Right.
Right?
Exactly. Like,
But it
could
seems
this
like
not be an
everything.
immediate marriage? Like, why don't we, can I give it a shot first, or
Yeah,
do I have to commit for
right.
the rest of my life?
Right. Right, right. So then just kind of the final is like if hopefully we, the age of the tech CEO hero comes to the end, like who do you think people will start to look to, or who can they start to look to as far as, innovation and the future and the
Mhm.
possibility?
Yeah, great question. I think what I'd love to see is more diverse teams take the spotlight and those teams get the credit.
Hmm.
Plus, another exciting thing that I'm looking forward to there being more of, and I've tried to do more and more of this work myself as well too, is where products and companies are being built not just to make money but to make a difference. I think I'm really excited for that. The world of impact investing is growing really rapidly,
Hmm.
and I think this is a really good thing. So we put our dollars to good use because there's more than just making money and creating value that way, right? There's a lot of problems the world needs solved, and I'd love to see more businesses focus in this area. And I think we are with the younger generation, which is really exciting.
Yeah.
So love to see more diversity. There's not much in tech. A lot of the people at the top are from one very specific demographic.
Look like you.
Exactly. Like they just look like me, right? It's like, okay, I think we got enough white guys in those roles. Like maybe we can mix it up a little bit. Like,
Sure,
so
sure.
love to
I've been
see
trying
that.
to mix it up for 20 years.
We need so much more of it. And it's so obvious to me. It's like every time I'm on a team that's more diverse, better ideas, better innovation, different life experiences, it works better for the world because the whole world isn't white guys, right?
Yeah.
So this stuff is so obvious to me, but it is still so painfully slow to develop. So I'm excited for more diversity to take the spotlight.
Yeah, for sure. So let's make it all make sense. Okay. Many of the negative headlines we see in the news, we can be traced back to some core beliefs in the Silicon Valley led startup and investment community. Software engineering still is a little bit of a wild west, but we're going to see some gains to hopefully speed up our ability to improve and serve our customers. So we're all both excited about that, and some hopefully we can see a bunch more diversity leading tech industry in general, so they can be our heroes versus the former. So thank you for listening to Make Sense with me, your host, Lindsay Tabus, and guest, Sean Boyce. We hope you enjoyed our take on the future of engineering and VC-driven startup growth. If you want to continue to be the smartest person in the room, hit that subscribe or follow button for next week's episode. I'm in the early days with this, and every subscriber on YouTube specifically makes a huge difference. As always, check out the links and resources in the show notes. We've got some things from Sean to share. And that's all for this episode. Catch up with you next time.